Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to our analyst and media briefing, this time for the third quarter of 2011 for SM Investments Corporation. And as usual, before I start, let me first introduce our panels, the members of the panel. I'll start with our president, Mr. Harley C. From David Salon. I'm just kidding. And then beside him on the right is Mr. Jose Shaw, our CFO. And then I'll start now from the extreme right, Mr. Robert Cui, President of SM Hypermarkets, Mr. Mr. Jojo Mendiola, President of SM Retail Department Store. And then we have Jeff Lim, Executive Vice President and CFO of SM Prime. And we have Rose Kwa, President of SM Development Corporation. Beside her is Mr. Ray Villar, Executive Vice President for SM Hotels and Conventions. And then we have Mr. Louis Benitez, the CFO of SM Land and Senior Vice President. And beside him is Mr. Luis Reyes, or Chito Reyes, the IR Officer of BDO. And finally, we have Alex Escucha, the IR Officer of China Bank. So let me now start with our third quarter results. As you know, the Philippine economy had not done better than last year, so actually we are faced with a more challenging environment. Plus, we have also a very challenging global environment to add to that. And as you would know, the environment is not as easy as it was last year in terms of growth. But we're very happy to say that the net income of SM Investments continued to grow at a very healthy pace of 14%, achieving a net income of 14.2 billion pesos, with from revenues of 140 billion pesos, which was up 13%. As a result, we are able to maintain our net margin of 10% with an earnings per share of 34 pesos per 4 pesos per share. In terms of relative contribution to the group, the banks continue to have the biggest contribution of 31.1%, followed by retail with 28%, property with 17%, malls with 23%, and property with almost 18% now. If you recall, about 5 years ago, property group only contributed less than 5%, and it's good to see now that, it's becoming a very significant contributor to the net income of SM Investments. In terms of actual growth for their earnings, the retail group grew by 12% to 4 billion pesos, the malls by 14% to 6.4 billion, property by 38% to 3.8 billion, and the banks were up 9% to 11 billion pesos. In terms of our balance sheet, that continues to remain healthy. Total assets actually grew by 19% to 418 billion pesos. And our book value increased by 9% to 241 pesos per share. In terms of our financial position, basically you have a net debt to equity of only 32 to 68, which is a very reasonable level of borrowing, and we intend to keep it that way. Our ROE is maintained at about 14%. In terms of the retail operations, their sales grew by 10% for the period with a net income growth of 12%. So there's a very good recovery in the third quarter for retail, and net margin is about 4% for the whole group on an ROE of 44%. The total number of stores increased to 158, coming from only 131 last year. And out of that 158, the number of new stores for department store, they only opened one so far, but they'll be opening more towards the end of the year, whereas the supermarkets, including the hypermarkets, increased by 18 stores. For mall operations, they've already announced that their income increased by 14% to 6.4 billion pesos on revenues of 19.3 billion, and this was up 13%. ROE of 14% thus far, with a net margin of 33%. Their total assets increased by 15% on a book value of 4.4 pesos per share, and that was up 18%. Their net debt to equity is very much similar to that of the parent company, which is 32.68, and an ROE of 14%. As you know, SM Prime has the largest footprint as far as malls are concerned. They have a total GFA of 5.1 million square meters. This is only in the Philippines. Okay, they have more in China, with 41 malls so far. And majority of the GFA is actually still in Metro Manila, so there's so much more growth potential in the provinces. They're currently expanding faster in Cebu and Davao, where they only have a GFA contribution of 5% in Cebu, and in Davao it's only 2%. So there's so much room for growth in these areas. For next year, they're opening Davao, General Santos, and Consolacion in Cebu. And then as far as expansion is concerned, they'll be expanding Clark and Bacolod. But you can ask more from Jeff about these later. In China, we opened Suzhou with 73,000 GFA, and that seems to be doing well. Again, Jeff can give you feedback in terms of the occupancy levels and the foot traffic in Suzhou so far. This is the photo of the Suzhou mall, the actual photo. I think the last photo I showed you was more of an artist rendering. So the major tenants there are Vanguard, Hypermarket, KFC, Jack and Jones, and Wanda Cinema. Some names of these are not really familiar to us, but they're quite popular in China. And these are the ones that are people are watching out for in China. So next year we're bound to open Chongqing, and then Tianjin Chibo the year after that in Tianjin in 2025.